Hugh, I like this question. Hopefully I'm saying that right. Pronouns are him, he, him, and Illinois wants to discuss hard atheism and how we could say that God doesn't exist. That's up my alley.
Yeah, hey.
How's it going?
Hey, good. Yeah, so Jmike, I think I've talked to you a couple of times. I think once on Clubhouse, and I know I've talked to you on Discord. So I wanted to kind of bounce this off of you guys. I don't really go to like these debates, so I haven't really tried this out. So
I know who this is. Sorry, I'm so sorry. Now I know who this is. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No worries.
Yeah.
No worries. Yeah. So the previous calls kind of made me call in because you guys were talking about sort of hard and soft atheism, and I think was it Kristen that was saying whether atheists look down at agnostics, etc. So I want to kind of talk about sort of where I stand, and then kind of get your feedback on how whether they're host to.
Sure. Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, so just to kind of set the stage right, I think most of us know that from a soft atheist position is that it's more of a belief state, right? That there's no evidence that demonstrates that God exists, and this would be an agnostic atheism, right? That we don't claim a knowledge position. So a hard atheist, and I consider myself a hard atheist, the position is that no God exists, and you can sort of call it a Gnostic atheism. And most people in general would avoid this position because, the whole burden of proof thing, right? A Gnostic atheist is they're essentially making a positive claim, that a God doesn't exist. And they would have to provide some proof, right, that a God doesn't exist. So this is very difficult, right? Proving the non-existence of something, and I think,
could I chime in right there? Because I think that's where part of the mistake comes into place. I don't think there's any requirement of proving. Like, I believe God does not exist. I don't have to give you a deductive proof that concludes that God does not exist. I can give you because my reasoning is taking theoretical virtues of the worldview and comparing them and then seeing which one favors out. And my view is that naturalism ends up winning on all of those kind of cases. You just have to give justification that raises the probability that that proposition is more likely to be true than not. So I think there's a giant mistake with thinking you have to be certain. I don't think knowledge requires certainty. I think that's like a giant confusion. I think our beliefs have credences. We give credences to the beliefs that we have or propositions. I'm more confident about what I ate for breakfast this morning than I am probably about, like, I don't know, something I learned in science the other day, right? You give credences to the beliefs. But anyway, I just want to preface that I personally find it a mistake to think that the quote unquote, hard atheist has to give you a deductive proof. I don't think the theist has to do that either. I think they need to give you reasons that justify that proposition being true. Maybe I lower the bar a little bit if that's what people want to think. I just don't think you can. I'm very skeptical of deductive arguments in philosophy. Like, I'm just going to prove something to you with a bunch of statements, and you're just going to be like, oh, I have to bow down to this thing now. I'm not very convinced by that. But anyway, sorry.
Yeah, and no, I think you're essentially kind of preempting my conclusion.
Sorry. Okay, so I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
No, that's fine.
I'll shut up.
The only thing I would say about that is I think in general, when there are discussions with theists, and their kind of go-to, knee-jerk reaction is, well, if you don't think God exists, prove it, right? So it's more of that rather than, somehow kind of, there's sort of a formal requirement. So that's where I think the BOP issue comes in. And I think that's why a lot of atheists are kind of reluctant to, claim hard atheism, because, they probably run across that. But I agree with you. And that's kind of where I'm getting to, right? So, obviously this, quote unquote, proving the non-existence of something, the evidence of non-existence is not a proof that it doesn't exist, right? And the whole black swan fallacy. So, I definitely agree with you. And kind of along with what you're saying, we just normally don't go around, creating proofs of non-existing things, right? We don't, somehow we're not required to create
for anything you believe. For anything you believe, you don't go like, give me premise one of like why you ate an egg sandwich or something. Like, this is not how we talk to each other,
Right. So normally what happens is that, you sort of get in a position where you have to disprove something if someone says something exists, right? So if someone says, and I think the example in the previous call, or maybe this was on a different call-in show where, you saw something and you want to claim that that's God, then you're sort of saying, okay, then you have to provide some evidence. So, if there is something that kind of, I guess, requires you to, come up with either a proof or a disproof, that makes sense. There has to be a hypothesis that's based on something, right? You can't just create a hypothesis out of the air and say, I hypothesize that a magical unicorn exists, right? There needs to be something that kind of preempts that belief. So that's normally how it would work. And from a God belief, I think there's, I would say 2 or maybe 3 things. So one is that, in terms of what actually exists, we know that the belief of God exists, right? We know there's religion, that there's people who believe, and in fact, we know that there's lots of it. And for that, I would say that, that's a valid hypothesis, and, we know that it exists. And I think the response would be that, do we have a good explanation for those beliefs? And, my contention is we do. If we look at psychology, even evolutionary, evolution, sociology, anthropology, all those things tells us, how a religious belief can come into being. And we even have seen it in our, I guess, depending on how old you are, within our lifetime, basically Scientology and Mormonism are basically religions that were created, right, in a sense. They're and have, kind of contemporaneous evidence that gives us a good reason to believe that those belief systems were created by man, right?
So you want to give a strong inductive case with our set of prior, background knowledge, that you have this really strong inductive case. I mean, I if that's where you're going, I agree. But I think you can if you're going on that inductive case, you can go really strong with this too. Every mind that we see has a body, right? Every single mind has a body that we see, right? There's a body, some physical substrate with a body. So the probability of disembodied minds, given your background information, you have a really strong inductive case that there aren't likely, right? I mean, now you don't want to commit to a black swan fallacy, like you said. It's like there are none, but you can give a really strong inductive case why you think that that's not probable and justify that belief. I mean, like, for example, this is an argument that someone that I know is given. They think that a mind can only be something that has a perspective on a world. And if God exists alone as a mind with no perspective, it's just these like internal kind of thoughts or whatever. Like that's like seems like incoherent. We know every single thing that we look into in the world that has beliefs about something, right? Something in the external world. And if there's an external world that goes with a mind, if it just turns out, like you're saying, that minds are late and local, what I mean is that they're late in this cosmological process. They're local to us right now in our direct experience of this, cosmological history. We have a really good, strong evidence that, look, you can't have minds without an external world kind of like preceding it. And thus there's just no option for a God to even exist, given what a mind is. Now people could say, oh, we could be confused on the concept, but like what your point, you're giving a strong inductive case for this proposition. And I don't think I think that's something that someone could go, oh, you haven't given justification. You're giving justification. Someone might not like it or whatever, but sorry. I just wanted to point out that
I think that's an interesting that you're making an interesting point about how as atheists we're making an inductive case, and yet every theist attempts to or an inductive case, and every theist attempts to make a deductive case for their God. And I think they make a mistake there too, because it's very easy to go for like the Kalam. The Kalam doesn't get you to God. Is it a strong deductive argument? Sure. But is the teleological argument a strong deductive argument? But yes, but as soon as you defeat one of the premises, the whole thing falls apart. Whereas the inductive case that we build, one, it's consistent with science because that's what science does. And two, we're admitting we don't know everything, and there are things out there that could prove it. So those are the things that I think we have to look at, because I go back to, as an example of trying to prove a negative, Sherlock Holmes case, which is The Sign of the Four. It's a locked room murder mystery, where the victim is in a room that has been locked from the inside. So, this is where we get the famous Sherlock Holmes quote, "If you've eliminated the possible, then the impossible must be possible." And he basically does that. He eliminates every possible case that he can think of for someone to be in the room and commit the murder. And it's only after he's eliminated every possibility, somebody standing behind the curtain, secret doors, the whole 9 yards, do you actually start looking for, okay, so how would I actually lock this room from the outside? And I know some people think that means that you immediately move to the supernatural, but no, you start looking at other possibilities. And he finds the little bit of string that leads him to think that, oh, hey, maybe somebody did it by tying a string to the key, and then he proves that actually is what happens. I think that's what you have to go through to actually prove definitively a negative like that, is you need to eliminate the most common and the most likely things, and then move on to the unlikely, and then actually demonstrate that those unlikely things happen. So that's the way that you prove a negative. We just can't do that with the universe. God could be hiding outside of the universe, whatever that means. Is it even possible to exist outside of the universe? Does time exist outside of the universe? We got lots more questions there. But to make an inductive case, like Jmike was saying, look at, and I believe you were saying too, there's every phenomena that we know of has a natural explanation, or we just don't know how it happens. And those are the, and all the other inductive ones as well.
Or compare those hypotheses, right? Like take the hypothesis that, God existed, creates the universe, or the initial state of the universe, and just be a naturalist, go, okay, there's a beginning of the universe under naturalism. We'll compare the data that we agree upon. Well, the naturalists can have this view that it's necessary that there's this initial state, right? This is no different than the way that they're positing God. Why is there something rather than nothing? There has to be something, and that being God. And at least the thing that I'm most sympathetic towards, what a philosopher Graham Oppie argues for, which I think this is right, that when you even do that, even when you play this game and you're like, I'll accept that there's a beginning of the universe, and you now compare the data, you can ask questions on the theistic hypothesis of like, okay, well, what explains why God created this initial state rather than some other, universe with just marbles or something? And you quickly find out that the desire for life is packed in, right? The desire for all these stuff, like, demon possession, all of this angels, all this stuff, supernatural stuff, all gets packed into the hypothesis. It's not just this like simple hypothesis. And when we go to look to the explanatory side, and we can't even explain why did God create this initial state, or these constants this way rather than another way, without just kind of throwing in the desire, because he desires life, without just arbitrarily assessing it, you don't get an actual explanation for the data. You don't get an explanation why God did this rather than another. And if you're someone who's thinking you need a principle of sufficient, reason, or you need an explanation for all these things, well, if it turns out that on my view, the universe is, the initial state, like t equals 0, the singularity has to exist. And I fully explain that in a way you're satisfied with God always existing, but you can't even explain why God creates, one universe rather than a different. It doesn't sound like the theistic hypothesis is offering up explanation, right? It sounds like they're missing explanation. And I think when you do this process, fine tuning or whatever it is, and you compare this with a naturalistic view, what ends up turning out is that even in the place for naturalism where it might be improbable, it's just as improbable under theism with extra ontological baggage, right? With extra stuff that's just sitting there as an idle wheel. And so what you're left to do is, well, let me just shave off all the idle wheels, and you're just left with naturalism at that point. And I think that abductive case, if you want to call it that, I think that worldview comparison, I think that's like really all we can do with metaphysics, right? Because we don't have any methodology that tells us, the fundamental nature of reality. That's really the best we got are these kind of cases. I give some theist a deductive argument that says God doesn't exist. They're just going to deny one of my premises in my argument, right? I mean, that's just they're going to pull the cord and get off the bus. And so I think there's a mistake on these positions and how you can go about justifying it. I think comparing the views and having theoretical virtues such that one is simpler and explains the data, that's the view that you should go with. You shouldn't go with some arbitrarily complex view that doesn't explain the data. And so, sorry, long-winded, But I think you can confidently call yourself an atheist or a naturalist or someone that says God does not exist without having to give a deductive proof, right?
Yeah, so I think just from the inductive side, I believe that, I would actually take it beyond what you had said, where I think you can essentially say that no God exists within this framework, right? Within our naturalistic framework, there's no reason for us to have to, come up with a deductive argument for what we're seeing, because we have good rationale for, what we're seeing within reality. How does a God belief come about? How do people come to these beliefs? All these, quote unquote, archaeological artifacts, all those are explainable. And I think we only need to step outside of it if there's some additional information that a theist comes and says, here is something that your inductive argument cannot explain, right? At that point, I think you could say, well, then, then this inductive argument doesn't work out, and so there might be a chance that God exists. I just think that until that happens, you can essentially just conclude.
That's actually a really good point, because that's actually a good point in the sense that strip it down easy, what I'm going to say is that naturalism is simpler, like in all cases, right? And not just like the simple term of simple. I mean something very specific, less fundamental axioms that you have to posit in your theory, less terms and predicates. Like I don't have to use, like me and Jim don't have to invoke jinn or genie or like demon or spiritual, right? Like those terms, those predicates play no role in when we try to describe our theory of naturalism. And so clearly, me and the theist, we have similar commitments. They're committed to the existence of electrons. They're committed to axioms of classical logic. They're committed to all of these things that you don't derive from God existing or the proposition that God exists. So it turns out we agree, we have the same kind of fundamental axioms in a lot of ways, the same terms that we use, like quarks and electron, that eventually break down where we can't define them anymore. But they have more of those things, right? It's just simple. They believe in all the same natural world kind of stuff that I believe in, plus a whole bunch more stuff. Now, it's not the case that naturalism wins because our view is simpler. It has less axioms, less predicates, less idealization, right? All of this stuff. They could win. What they'd have to do is show that that you have to posit more stuff, right? God, you're not explaining the data with just this few amount of stuff here. You need more stuff like God. But that project never works when I actually go through this comparison with theists. It always turns out that these extra commitments are just idle wheels that do nothing to explain the data. They don't do any heavy lifting explanatorily. And so again, it's not to say just because your view isn't simpler, or your view is more complex or adds more things, that it's false. You have to show why it's necessary to add those things. And that fails. And thus, I think we should be naturalists. But Jim, I'm sorry. I feel like you want to come in, maybe say something. I'm just kind of spewing at this moment. So I'm passionate about this part of the kind of debate.
No, I don't disagree with anything. I mean, I have a different take on it because I have a different brain and different experiences, but I don't disagree with anything you said. And I don't think anything I can add to it for this discussion. And I wish I'd taken some notes because I might have been able to translate some of that for some of our.
Sorry.
But yeah, no, I don't have any problems with anything you said.
All right. Naturalism is a simpler theory that explains all the data, and we should be confident as naturalists. At least that's what I say.
Yeah. So I just to play devil's advocate, I think that's where the theist comes in. The precept theists come in, right? To say that, in order for you to have all those naturalistic beliefs, or et cetera, you have to posit God, right? And they obviously provide no real.
Yeah, I asked for the support for the first premise of tag. Like I chase presuppositionalists around asking them.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I get it. The claim is you can only have intelligibility if and only if the Christian God exists. What reason do I have to accept that? Like, give me, what's the argument for that? And you get nothing. It's crickets, right? Every time. It's like, okay, I mean, I smoked the bowl in the woods and naturalism revealed it. Like I looked at a tree and it was like, God doesn't exist. It just revealed itself to me that naturalism was true. It's like, you can fucking do that at any point. So it's Anyway, Q, I don't know if you want to, anything else. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just one last thing, and this will be the last thing. So just call out to some of the theists who get on the comments and claim that they beat atheists all the time. We're talking about Jim and Neppy and Brad from Kentucky. All those guys, you guys need to call in or just shut up.
Anyone call in, theist or not, we won't bite. I mean, I'm not. It doesn't have to be like, but we can have a good discussion.
Yeah. Yep. And if you're in the comments claiming that you've defeated atheists and you haven't called in, you're a liar. Call in.
Yep. Definitely. All right. Thanks, guys.
Well, I don't know about you. That one comment, my atheism's in shambles now. I don't even know what to think anymore. So we will. Thank you so much, Q.